Welcome to the Global Leadership Podcast, where we go behind the scenes and unpack the stories behind some of today's most effective and dynamic leaders. I'm Lori Herman, the executive producer of the Global Leadership Summit and one of your hosts. This week's guest is New York Times bestselling author Jon Acuff. I sat down with Jon in front of a live studio audience and had a chance to dig into his life and how he approaches his work. He shared some practical tools that he uses to keep fear and chaos at a manageable level. Some key questions he uses to evaluate the potential of a new book, business, or creative idea, and what he does in his morning routine to establish a positive mindset for the rest of the day. But before we dive in, if you enjoy this interview, register for GLS Special Edition on February 16th, 2023. Jon Acuff will be back on our stage sharing his insights and recent research about how to reach your full potential. In addition, we'll hear talks from Cint Marshall, Jose Hernandez, Heather Younger, Robert Morris, and Craig Rochelle. Learn more on our website at globalleadership.org. Also, if this is bringing value to your leadership, please remember to subscribe and rate. It helps other leaders find our podcast. And now, here's Jon Acuff. Well, Jon, welcome to the Global Leadership Podcast. Thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I think it's going to be a lot of fun.
Well, one of the things we are really curious about are stories behind the leader. So I appreciate you sitting down and having a conversation. As I've been thinking about you, you coach organizations and leaders, you write, you speak. Of all that you do, what's your favorite?
The speaking for me is my favorite thing, and the writing fuels that. So I love the writing, but being on stage is the best part of what I spend my entire year to get to be on 50 stages for 45 minutes a pop. So that to me says, boy, I love being on stage.
Wow, that's awesome. You've written 7 books, going on 8. And what's your favorite?
My favorite is soundtracks. For me, before I wrote it, I deliberately said the soundtrack for this book is going to be light and easy. Because that, as a believer, is what I'm promised, that the burden is light and easy. So I had that on a note on my wall, that it was going to be light and easy. Because the previous books, my wife about 4 years ago said, and I didn't get to share this today, a speech is like an accordion. You're expanding it and contracting it based on the audience reaction, based on what's happening. So I didn't get to say this today, but about 4 years ago, my wife said, I signed the biggest book deal I'd ever had. And she said, hey, you're a jerk for the 2 years when you write a book, and you're a jerk for the 2 years when you sell a book. And that doesn't work for our marriage. She said, I'd rather you be a happy plumber than a miserable writer. And what she was saying was that for me to produce work, I was using chaos as a fuel. If you've ever worked with a leader who's great at putting out fires, when there's no fire, they start fires. Because leaders don't like to feel worthless. They don't like to feel valueless. So when there's not a fire, they start a fire. Now you don't work with a leader. Now you work with an arsonist. And so for me, that was my fuel, was stress and chaos. And so in order to do a book, I would have to stir up all this stress. And a lot of it was fake. Things were going fine. But I'd go, if I don't really crush this book, like the bank's going to take the farm from us, like all these stories. And so I really had to look for new soundtracks and new fuel to propel me into a new book. And so Light and Easy was one of those soundtracks. And I really felt like, even though I feel it's the best book I've written, it was also the lightest and the easiest. And so that's why it's my favorite.
So what are some of the practical tools that helped you kind of keep the chaos down and make that shift in how you write?
Well, I think there's a couple. One, I mentioned the note. I always tell people, fear comes free, hope takes work. Fear will find you. You never have to look for fear. Fear will land on you in the grocery store about something dumb you did 10 years ago. Now, what's interesting about the English language, we don't even have an antonym for the word trauma. We, in the English language, don't have the opposite of the word trauma, meaning we don't have a word that means it's such an overwhelming joy that it catches you off guard 20 years later and washes over you, because trauma is so powerful. And so for me, I put in work to being positive. I put in work to changing soundtracks. So seeing the truth, light and easy on a note. And I had a bunch of notes. It wasn't the only note. Community helps. I'm in a community of entrepreneurs, an entrepreneur prayer group that meets every Monday, and having other entrepreneurs helps, because when you run a business, when you're a leader, it's an isolating experience. It's not just lonely at the top, it's lonely in leadership. So that's why rooms like this are important. It's why host sites are important, because you need community. So those were the reminders, the community, and also just being really deliberate about the pace of it. I think as a leader, you have these big visions that you want to do, and you're so passionate, you want to finish them, you want to get them done. And so you really need to look at it. I started measuring it in hours, not in final goal. If you only have one finish line between your start and the finish line, you're doomed. No one can hold their breath for 13 miles in a half marathon, which is why they have signs at every mile, 1 mile, 2 mile, 3 mile, 4 mile. And I think as a leader, you need to have as many milestones as you need, so you don't have to go that far between this is difficult work and I did something I'm proud of. This is difficult work and I did something I'm proud of. So those are some things that from a practical sense helps me.
So when you're getting ready to write a book, how do you decide what topic or what direction you're going to go in?
Yeah, so for me, I have kind of this Venn diagram of what I feel a best-selling idea has, or a best-selling business, or a sermon, or a speech. So I look for three things. One, I look for a personal connection to the topic. So I try to find a question that won't leave me alone. We heard from Sahar. She said, I wasn't trying to gain market share. I wanted the type of coffee I wanted in the city I lived that was made of tea. So she had a personal connection to that. That's the first thing. The second thing you look for is a need. Is there real need in my community for this thing? Am I hearing about it from neighbors? Am I hearing about it online? Am I hearing about it from some of our, customers? The third thing is you look for your spot in the market. So is there a spot for me to fit here? And I always say, that's my Venn diagram, because you have to have all three. If you say you have a passion, like you have something you love and people need it, but it's already served in the marketplace, that's a cake pop. If you told me today, John, I got this crazy new idea I'm going to do, it's called Cake Pops, I'd be like, I have some terrible news. By the time it's at Starbucks, you're probably 10 years late. Now, if you told me, okay, John, I have this crazy passion, it's not being served in the marketplace, but nobody needs it, that's a hobby. I love that you have a hobby. It's so cool that you're into ferrets and you want to do albino ferret ownership tips so they don't get sunburned. That's awesome. Have a newsletter, but that's a hobby because people don't need that. If you have a need in the market and you find a hole in the marketplace, but you're not passionately connected to it, you just created yourself a new day job. It might make money, it might do okay, but you won't have the heart to stay with it. So when I find a topic, so for instance, Finish. I wrote a book called Finish. These are long answers, but I love nerding out about this. So for me, Finish, I wasn't good at finishing things in my life. I was a chronic starter and I wanted to learn, can I turn into being a consistent finisher? Are you born with it or can you learn it? I had half-filled notebooks, half-written books, exercises that never took off. And so I had the personal connection. Second, I wrote a book a few years ago called Start, and I had a lot of people come up to me and go, hey, no offense, I liked your book Start, but I've never had a problem starting. I can start a million things today. Leaders, every leader in this room probably has some terrible GoDaddy URL they registered that they're like, that's going to be huge. My wife and I have an agreement that if I haven't done something with the URL in a year, I have to release it back to the wild. So heads up, wordninja.tv, very available, because I released that back to the wild. And so for me, that was part of it, was okay, I'm connected. I see people need this book because they've said I need the book. And then I went into my marketplace, which is Amazon. And if you look for the word Finish in Amazon, the first thing that comes up is dishwasher detergent. And so what I realized is we as a culture over-celebrate the beginning of goals and we ignore the end. There's a million books about the beginning. We have kickoff parties. We have launch parties. We very rarely talk about the finish because it's so challenging. So I thought, okay, wow, I see the three things. I think I'm going to do that. Same with soundtracks. I'm an overthinker. I was overthinking right there. Did I overtalk to Erwin McManus? Did I talk too much? Because I was talking to him a minute ago and I was telling him something I was excited about. And then I was sitting in that chair going I should have shut up a little more. That could have, he probably had some cool California things to say and I didn't hear any of them. And so I'm an overthinker. We asked 10,000 people if they struggle with overthinking. 99.5 said yes, so there's need. I go to the market and the books were either stop it, stop it, stop it, which is impossible, or they weren't funny. and I didn't find them practical. So like they were super serious or super holistic, like no real practical stuff where I'm like, when somebody tells me something, I'm like, okay, well, how do I do it? What are the steps I do? That's why I said Tuesday, like Global Leadership Summit is an amazing Friday. It's also an amazing Tuesday. It's also an amazing next Thursday. So that's my process for finding ideas. So I know like the next handful of books where I'm like, oh, okay, I can see that part. Let me see if there's this part. And once I've got those three things, then I feel pretty confident it's going to be good.
Because the last 2 or 3 years have been really difficult, how have you kept yourself in a good place?
I mean, not initially. Initially, I just was super frustrated. I would say for like 6 weeks. My wife would say for like 3 months, probably. January, I did an event where I got to open and do comedy for Dolly Parton at the Ryman. And I was like, this is going to be the greatest year ever. Like, I remember driving away in January being like, if this is January of 2020, like the rest of the year. And then like, I don't know if anybody else had that where like, it's going to be a great year. And then it was just like, yeah. So I just remember it's March. We're at my in-laws' house and like every live event is getting canceled, rightfully so. And I'm just like, okay. And it was the largest part of my business. And I've got a book to release that is based on me being able to get on stage and talk about the book. And so, yeah, I would say the first 6 weeks, it was just really frustrated. I was not doing the things that keep me healthy, like running, connecting with people. It's terrible that like when you get into a spiral, you ignore the things that actually help you. But eventually I got to a place where I was like, I can pine or I can plan. I can pine for the old way. I wish it was easier. Or I can just start planning. And so I started to do stuff. I started doing YouTube. I was like, I've never done YouTube. I'm going to try that. And the videos are terrible, like terrible. Like,
we're going to all look now.
Yeah, that's fine. Like if you go back to March of like, and I'm like, hey, what's it? Like no plan. I'm just like, I got to do something like that. And so I tried new things. And then I asked myself a question that's helped me a lot. And I said, what would have made this season easier? And so I thought through that. And then I said, well, let me go build that. So a year from now, I'm glad I have that. So part of the reason I have a podcast is I said, what would have made this easier? It would have been easier if I had a podcast where I could have another revenue stream eventually, communicate ideas with clients, connect with customers. I didn't have that. So I didn't shame myself for not having it. It's such a waste of time to beat yourself up for not starting earlier. That ship has sailed. So then I just built a podcast. So once I got into that mode, and then once I started writing again and kind of getting that muscle back, but then like I really got into walks with friends. Like it's such an old person thing to say, like I like to go on walks. Like I might as well whittle. But like I really started walking with other guys and just like processing life. And I don't know that I would have done that as much as I have now had the pandemic not happened.
What's the first thing you do when you get up in the morning?
First thing I do when I get up in the morning, I usually make coffee. Right now, I've got an August goal to spend 30 minutes on Gospels, God, sermon, and 15 minutes on motivational content. Like I realize like 95% of my thoughts are negative and unhelpful. And so like, well, let me do something about that. So I'm pushing back against that. So I usually try to do that first. Like I'm in the Word, I'm listening to a sermon, I'm listening to like, I love old school Jim Rohn, like ROHN, like he's from the 70s. And I heard him say something the other day. He was talking about the seasons and he said, you can plant in the spring or beg in the fall. And I was like, come on, dude. So like, I'm deliberately trying to digest motivational, helpful stuff that pushes me forward versus starving myself all day and then being like, it's weird I'm negative today. It's weird that happened. Well, yeah, you did. Like if you didn't eat all day, you shouldn't at the end of the day be like, man, it's so odd that I'm hungry. Like a friend would go, did you eat today? And be like, I didn't. I don't think that's connected though. It's got to be something deeper. I've got to really go on a vision quest of like, no. So those are the first two things I do.
What is the best part of all the travel that you get to do?
Oh, it's got to be the people. Like it's 100%. And like, it's got to be the people. It's got to be on stage. It's the conversations. Like it was even fun today. Like I recognized people from the book signing line. When I came in, there was 2 people that have a landscaping company and their goal is 50 million. I was like, 50 million, like that's fun. Or, hey, here's the CrossFit couple and they're from, Florida and they know somebody I know in Nashville that's CrossFit. So it's got to be the people. Like I could share all the ideas I want in my office. There's no people. So the difference between my office and something like this is 100% the people.
So how can we keep following up with you? Where can we find you?
Yeah, the podcast that I have is called All It Takes Is a Goal, and you can listen to that anywhere you listen to podcasts. My website is just acuff.me. And then I'm Jon Acuff on Twitter and Instagram. And then your new playlist will be out September 13th, whenever this releases, anywhere books are sold.
Well, thank you for that. One last question. We like to ask people, so what are you curious about these days?
I'm really curious about bravery. I think that's going to be the next book. So I've got another book that comes out in the fall about potential. I did a big study about potential. Why don't we live up to it, and what can we do about that? But I think the book after that's going to be about bravery. So I'm kind of starting. It takes me about 500 to 700 hours to write a book. And I tracked it this last book, which has been a huge gift, because now when I'm discouraged in the first 50 hours, I have a note from the last one that goes, remember, at 50 hours, you don't know anything. Remember, at 100 hours, here's where we are. Remember, because that makes it, I can do workmanship that way. It's not mysterious. We put so much pressure on something that's already pressurized when we don't have systems for it. And so I'm in the early stages of going, okay, what is bravery? Like, how are people born brave? Can you learn bravery? Are there specific types? Like, what happens when you take responsibility? So I'm curious about like bravery and about taking responsibility. And, again, that Jim Rohn, that dude's killing me. He had something the other day. He says, quit wishing life was easier. Start wishing you were better. I was like, dang it, that's so good. That's so good. So listening to wise people and going, as I've kind of turned on a bright light, and I'm waiting for the moths to come towards this that are about bravery. So that's what I'm curious about.
Well, I'm so glad that you write Post-it notes and ask questions, because as you seek out those answers and write them down and share it with us, it helps us all. So thank you so much, Jon. Thanks for joining us on the podcast.
This is fun.
This was such a fun conversation with Jon. I was really struck by how intentional and thoughtful he is. In addition to being upbeat and fun, Jon has real depth. I thought he had great advice for entrepreneurs when he shared some questions that help him decide on the topic of his next book. Maybe these questions will be helpful for you too. Do you have a personal connection? Is there a need? Is there a spot for this in the market? I love that Jon said his best ideas are received, not forced, and that he sees himself as a steward of those ideas. What a humble perspective. Jon clearly has a good soundtrack playing in his head. His book Soundtracks was relevant and practical. It's so great that he now has a version that he wrote with his daughters for teens. Check them out. Just a reminder, if you want to hear more from Jon, you can join us in February for GLS Special Edition. You can find a link in our show notes for more information. Thanks for listening to the Global Leadership Podcast, and until next time, keep leading right where you are and keep getting better.